Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Gonzalez. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at the Lymphoma Research Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Navigating a Rare Lymphoma Diagnosis webinar. During today's program, you will learn information about rare lymphomas directly from a lymphoma specialist with experience in this area, and you will also have the opportunity to ask questions. You can ask them at any time during the program in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can after the presentation. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. At the end of the program, you will be prompted to complete a program evaluation. Please complete this evaluation as we do incorporate your feedback into future programs. Before we officially get started, I'd like to share with you a few brief words about the Lymphoma Research Foundation. The Lymphoma Research Foundation is the largest nonprofit organization that focuses specifically on lymphoma and chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Our mission is to realize the promise of science to eradicate lymphoma and serve the community touched by this disease. And all of our work is overseen by our Scientific Advisory Board, which is a group of 45 leading lymphoma experts from around the country. In addition to today's program, the Foundation has many other programs and services that are available to you. We offer both in-person and virtual programs so that you can continue your learning throughout the year. Our in-person programs include our Lymphoma Talks, which are evening dinner programs that will be held this year in Miami, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, and Minneapolis. And our virtual programs include webinars such as this program, our Ask the Doctor About Lymphoma series that's primarily focused on what newly diagnosed patients should know, our Living with Lymphoma series featuring supportive care topics, and lastly, our Educational Forum on Lymphoma, which is our largest two-day program that takes place every fall. To view specific dates about upcoming programs, you can visit lymphoma.org/programs. In addition, the Foundation offers a variety of support services. Our helpline, which serves to complement our patient education programs, is a resource for both patients and care partners. The helpline has master's level trained staff who can provide individualized information on all types of lymphoma, as well as treatment options, clinical trial navigation, and connections to resources such as financial assistance. We also offer a peer support program called the Lymphoma Support Network. Through the Lymphoma Support Network, we can connect patients and care partners with others who have been through a similar experience for emotional support. The Lymphoma Research Foundation also offers comprehensive disease guides and fact sheets, which can be ordered or downloaded for free on our website, lymphoma.org. And please also look for us on YouTube, where we spotlight different lymphoma subtypes and treatment options. And finally, I would also like to highlight our Spanish language resources for those of you who would find information in Spanish helpful. I would also like to take a moment to thank our program supporters. Thanks to their generosity, we're able to host programs like today's webinar. And well, we have a wonderful program scheduled for you today, and I'm so honored to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Neha Mehta Shah. Dr. Mehta Shah is a hematologist-oncologist at Washington University, where she is an associate professor of medicine in the Division of Oncology. She's also a previous grantee of our Lymphoma Scientific Research Mentoring Program and our Career Development Award. Dr. Mehta Shah, thank you very much for being here. We're thrilled to have you, and I'll hand over the program to you.
Thanks so much for having me. Always a great pleasure of mine to work with the LRF, who I feel very indebted to. So let me share my slides. Okay, I think you should be able to see them. Is that good, Victor?
Yes.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about navigating a rare lymphoma diagnosis, and we'll talk a little bit about what to go through, what you might go through as a patient or a caregiver, and then also then to talk about rare lymphoma research, which is of course very dear to my heart. These are my disclosures. So what are lymphomas and how do you make a diagnosis? So those of you who have participated in some of the Lymphoma 101 series lectures or listened to those, we're going to just give you a very brief overview of some of that information. So lymphomas arise from normal lymph cells, and those lymph cells' normal job is to find an infection, fight that infection, and if that infection comes back, be ready to fight it in the future. And when these cells grow without there being an infection or trauma or an invader on their own, they can develop into lymphomas. And I tell patients, as well as our medical students, when we teach them that lymphomas occur as a result of a stop in the normal maturation process. What that means is that baby lymph cells are in the bone marrow, and they grow very quickly in the bone marrow. And if a cancer arises from those baby cells, they may turn into something called leukemia. Once those cells then exit the bone marrow and are approaching, trying to find their antigens or their targets, but have not yet found them, if they stop differentiating in that phase, they can become an aggressive lymphoma. The most common of those subtypes is called diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And then one other very well-known subtype is a Burkitt lymphoma. And that cell actually learns to divide every 6 hours in its normal activity. Some of those cells then interact with what we call a germinal center or an antigen, and then can develop into more mature cells. If the halt in maturation occurs at that point, they can become a mature lymphoma, and we sometimes refer to these as indolent lymphomas. And then the mantle zone is like this in-between zone where the cells are coming from a different group of the lymph cells in the lymph node, and those can derive into mantle cell lymphoma. So I think of this as like if it comes from the baby or infant cells, it can develop into a leukemia, the toddler cells into like an aggressive lymphoma, and then in the adult cells into an indolent lymphoma. Each of these is differentiated by the markers on their cell surface, as well as how those cells relate to each other under the microscope. Do they appear uniform in sheets? Are the abnormal cells scattered across the biopsy specimen? And that's how we figure out what type of lymphoma it is. How do we make sense of this? Well, the indolent lymphomas tend to be relatively slow growing. They're treatable, they're not curable. And some of these diseases, we opt to watch people initially. And then in the faster growing lymphomas, or the fastest growing lymphomas, these are treatable and potentially curable with treatments like chemotherapy treatments. And then T-cell lymphomas, their ontogeny is a little bit different. So we won't get too far in the weeds with that. So how do we diagnose lymphomas? It all comes down to the biopsy. In cancer care, there is a mantra that tissue is the issue, or without no meat, no treat. And so always getting a biopsy is critical. And I think this is sometimes the challenge for patients who have rare lymphomas, is figuring out what the diagnosis is. That biopsy can be most often either a core needle biopsy, which is like a pencil lead size pieces of the tissue being extracted. That's usually done by like a radiologist, or an excisional biopsy where they actually do surgery and remove some section of the tissue as well. And we say the excisional biopsy is the most preferred in complicated cases, because if you look at like this picture, you can see this is a normal lymph node, and these are the normal follicles that you see, these circle thingies. And then if you were to take like a pencil size core, it could look like this picture or this picture, which look relatively simple. If you looked at the whole lymph node, they actually are quite different. This is a patient who has a benign condition, where it's a reactive condition where the patient does not have lymphoma, and this is an example of follicular lymphoma. And so sometimes this can be quite tricky to figure out. Then what the pathologists do to these pieces is take stains or to look for specific protein markers, and they check to see, do the cells express the same proteins? As I mentioned, each of the cells that comes from a different point in the maturation of the cells should have a specific pattern of proteins. They gain certain proteins and lose certain proteins in a very predictable fashion. And so if all the cells express a protein that they're not supposed to have, or they lose a protein they're supposed to have, that's a sign of it potentially being a cancer. And so the pathologists literally play the game of, which of these things doesn't belong here and which of these things is kind of the same, to try to figure out like what is similar between the abnormal cells and what is unique to them, to figure out, is this a cancer? They do that through staining. The stains in our world are called immunohistochemistry. They do that through flow cytometry, where they can look at one cell at a time. And then there are other molecular techniques like next generation sequencing, mutational analysis, as well as what we call B-cell and T-cell clonality assays. And happy to answer questions about those later too. In essence, all lymphomas are actually rare diseases, and we'll go over this on the next slide, but there's only about 80,000 cases of non-Hodgkin lymphoma per year. over 80% of them are B-cell lymphomas, about 10% are T-cell lymphomas. And each of those entities, B-cell lymphoma and T-cell lymphoma, actually represents many, many different diseases. And so each individual disease is actually a rare disease based on our national, international standards of what constitutes a rare disease. So then there are the rare, even the more common cancers, like diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, are still rare. They only occur in about 5.5 patients per 100,000 per year as well. So what defines a rare disease? So the rare disease based on the NIH is designated as a disease that occurs in less than 15 people per 100,000. And the European Association does less than 5 per 10,000 actually, or there's a national incidence of about 40,000 cases per year or less. And that constitutes a rare disease. Then there are very, very rare diseases called orphan diseases, where there's only less than 200,000 people living at any given time with that disease. And so that's an orphan disease. And why is that language important? Well, the language is important because in the 1980s, there was an understanding that rare diseases needed specific research. Pharmaceutical companies were not interested in studying rare diseases because they weren't going to, approving drugs in that space wasn't going to improve their profit margin too much. So no one was really studying rare diseases. But if you look across the country and you take everybody with rare diseases, it was almost 30 million people were affected by rare diseases or orphan diseases. And so it became important, and there was legislation passed to allow for financial incentives for companies to develop treatments in rare diseases to help promote rare disease research. And so the term orphan disease is important with regards to federal funding for clinical trials. So rare diseases are rare and they're super complicated. So not only are they rare, but they come in so many different subtypes, and each of those subtypes are ultra rare. So there are some like ultra rare lymphomas. Some of those include the T-cell lymphomas, where I have a particular passion, as well as certain other rare diseases like primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma. And in these very, very, very rare diseases, there is a limit of data available to help guide treatment. They're not necessarily large randomized studies where half the patients get one treatment, the standard treatment, half the patients get the new treatment, to help designate what should be the standard of care, because those studies are hard to perform or cannot be performed in these super rare diseases. And we'll explain why at the end of this talk. But having rare diseases can be particularly isolating for patients. I think, most people feel like, no, they don't know anybody who has anything remotely like them. It's hard for people to understand what they're going through. They feel like they don't necessarily have as much of a community. It's hard to find trustworthy information. They don't know what to read or how to find that information, or to know how do they get the right information to help educate themselves about their conditions. And there are often barriers in their care. It often takes a longer time to make the diagnosis. The healthcare team that would be that they would like to see, who may have expertise in the area, may not physically be in the area where you are, making it hard to make appointments and hard to figure out how to coordinate your care. And this all involves some self-education and advocacy, and not all of our patients have the resources to be able to do that either. So what happens if you are diagnosed with a rare lymphoma? How do you navigate this? So the first part is to know your diagnosis and to find reputable sources to help inform you. And I would say the LRF really does an exceptional job of this. Each year we update the materials that are available for patient guidance and information in language that is at the level of patients, to help give the most up-to-date information, as well as all the short videos. I think do a very good job of highlighting how experts would explain that disease to their patients, which I think can be incredibly helpful for a patient who may not have access to those experts at their front door. Reaching out for second opinions ends up becoming quite helpful. Certainly for us, we receive a lot of second opinions where we pair them with the community oncologist, but at least the community oncologist knows that we've reviewed the case, we agree with the diagnosis, and then we're able to guide them at key points in their treatment whether we be far from them or close to them. And this is particularly true, I would say, about the pathology, review of the pathology at an expert center, because some of these rare diseases, the pathologist only sees one case every few years. And they may have questions about the diagnosis itself, and getting a second pathology opinion of just reviewing the slides can be critical in someone's case as well. And then feel free to ask for help, and we're going to talk about this later too, but there are lots of resources through the Lymphoma Research Foundation and other advocacy groups. You can be put in touch with other people who have this disease, so that you can hear about their experiences and what they learned through their journey, which I think can also be incredibly helpful, as well as being put into patient support groups as well. What about, let's talk about all those things more in a little bit more depth. So what does it take to learn about your diagnosis? You may be in a position where your doctor tells you you're the only person they've ever met with this disease, or that they don't have a lot of experience with this disease. If that's the case, it's very reasonable to ask them, should I get a second opinion with someone who might be an expert? Do you work with anybody who's an expert in this area, to get some information to help guide your care? As I mentioned, read about your disease from reputable sources. As I mentioned, the LRF it does an exceptionally good job. And I'll highlight some other patient advocacy organizations that do a have a similar mission, that you may feel connected to. And then reach out reach out to these same patient advocacy groups for advice regarding contacting a specialist. So it's very common for people to contact places like the LRF to ask for, I was diagnosed with X disease. Who are people that you would recommend I see in this vicinity? And they should be able to give you an idea of who should be within driving distance, to be able to see for a second opinion as well. And they can be helpful in kind of connecting you to those people as well. There are some institutions that allow for virtual telemedicine visits. This world is changing because the Medicare, Medicaid laws for allowing telemedicine are also shifting. And so, some institutions' practices may be changing in light of those regulatory changes. And the other part I would say is sometimes I get questions from people all over the country being like, well, who is the best person to see? Or what is the best treatment? And sometimes in these diseases, there isn't one best doctor or one best treatment. And so to not feel discouraged by that. Some people I think are really looking for one person or one treatment really being far superior, and sometimes we just don't know. And being in a healthcare environment that you feel like you trust and you feel open asking questions is equally important. So who can help you through all this? So certainly your healthcare providers can certainly help you, doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants. That your patient disease networks, so places like the LRF can put you in touch with other patients who have been in your shoes. And then finding your advocates or finding your community. So that could be through the LRF. There are other rare disease organizations like the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation and the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and the Waldenstrom's Macroglobulinemia Foundation that also do a very good job of education on those specific rare diseases. And considering clinical trials is really important. I can't say this enough. I think in certain rare diseases, there are treatments that are available in clinical trials that may not be available elsewhere at all. And some of those trials are ongoing because we already know those drugs work in that subtype or the cousin of that subtype, making them particularly attractive for patients. So consider those trials, especially because in ultra rare diseases, sometimes there's very few options for standard of care treatment. Some of these trials are building upon, as I mentioned, drugs that are already known to work in this disease or the cousin of that disease. Some of these trials are open internationally and nationally as a collaboration between experts. Some of those are through things like the cooperative groups or the ECTCN, which is through the NIH. But usually there's been a lot of input from experts in the field about those studies and their design. And as I mentioned, they would give you access to treatment that you may not have access to otherwise. I was asked to speak a little bit about quality of life. And I think that my main message to all of you is to continue to live your life on treatment. Your life does not have to pause completely when you're on treatment. So be open with your healthcare providers about what's important to you. I think, we really try, like when our patients tell us that they have a specific family event, they have specific vacations that they plan for, they're concerned about specific side effects, that we really try to personalize your treatment to the things that are most important to them. So for example, we've had patients who are musicians who, their respiratory side effects were really important to them, or patients who are nurses who are really concerned about peripheral neuropathy as being a very important side effect to them. And so be open with your healthcare providers about things that are important to you, and based on where you are in your journey and what treatment you're on, they will, I'm sure, do their best to try to meet you, help you achieve those goals as well for your personal life. Um, try to live your life, but when you feel like it, there are going to be days where you don't feel like doing anything, and that's totally okay too. There have been studies, predominantly not in lymphoma, but in other cancers, showing that regular exercise, continuing your routine, continuing to go to work if physically possible, activities that focus on mindfulness, those have all been associated with improved quality of life, and then also with recovery after cancer treatment. And so trying to continue to do those things is important if you physically feel like you're up for it. Sometimes there are treatments where you don't. Take advantage of mental health resources. Some institutions do have free mental health counseling. I know ours does, which we think is instrumental in patient care. I think many patients feel that, especially when they have a rare disease, that their friends and family don't quite understand what they're going through. And they also are going through it with their friends and family. So their emotions also impact their friends and family's emotions, making it hard for them to feel open about their experiences. And certainly counselors can be a great resource in those situations, social work or psychology. Listening to your body is important. I would say, just if you notice things that are changing or bothering you, then to feel free to bring them up and make note of them. Don't push yourself past what you feel like you can do as well. And then we get lots of questions about diet and nutrition and supplements. And I would say sometimes we don't have any answers that are based on lots of data. But there are resources available to look up certain nutrition supplements and things that have been vetted by doctors throughout the country. And those are available too. And certainly the dietitians can help you with that as well. So as I mentioned, that this whole process can be isolating, and I think that's part of the reason why I think it's really important to consider your mental health through this process as well. So what can you do? Do talk about your experiences with your friends and your family. I think being open about it helps feel like you're less alone. We also recommend finding your own community, whatever that is, and feeling connected to it, because I think that does also help. And advocating for rare disease research, we think, is really important, especially in the current era. There are currently a lot of concerns about the funding of cancer research, as well as scientific research overall. And advocating for rare disease research, we think, is really, really important, because all of you are here listening today because you're affected by a rare disease. And no, there are lots of people fighting along besides you, really all over the world. Physicians, nurses, patient advocacy groups, clinical research personnel, who really have the social workers who really have the mission of trying to improve care for patients who have cancer. So now we're going to flip gears to talk about a little bit about like our day jobs and what are the challenges in rare disease research, specifically rare lymphoma research, to give you a little bit of perspective of that. So rare diseases, I mentioned, are rare, and they're also complicated, but they're also hard to study. So at any given center, if someone has one of these ultra rare diseases, the center, even a big center, may only see like 3 or 4 or 6 cases per year, which means some of these studies have to be like 300 to 600 patients. So you can imagine that it takes many, many, many centers, sometimes all over the world, to come together towards a goal and execute these clinical trials to then lead to FDA approval. And that requires a lot of money because the more centers that a study is open at, the more costly it becomes. So that requires investment from all parties, providers, healthcare providers, institutions to support doing this sort of work, industry, as well as patient advocacy groups, and of course, patients. These diseases themselves are understudied and also heterogeneous. So sometimes we have studies that are in a rare disease group, but there's actually many subtypes even within that study of patients who are eligible. For example, in T-cell lymphoma, often studies are in what we call peripheral T-cell lymphomas, which actually represents like 15 different diseases. So any one of those subtypes is actually even underrepresented even in those very large studies. We think that this breaking down and subclassification of these diseases has improved our understanding, but then leads to the development of even rarer entities, making it a little bit harder to study some of those very rare entities. And then the drug approval process has become increasingly complicated. There was an era where it was not required to have a randomized such a large randomized study to lead to FDA approval for orphan diseases. And that perspective has changed, requiring that these studies do have to lead to permanent FDA approval, do require large randomized studies. In some of those diseases, there's not a standard of care, leaving it hard to, randomize patients to the standard of care group because there's not necessarily one or not an attractive one for providers and patients, and it requires relatively large studies to be done. So let's talk about large. So I'll give you a couple of case examples, particularly coming from T-cell lymphoma cases, just to give you a perspective. So mogamulizumab was I would say, a revolutionary drug in patients who have cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, particularly in a subtype of that called Sézary syndrome. And mogamulizumab was compared to one of the pills that is considered a standard treatment called vorinostat, finding that the vorinostat only worked for 5% of patients and Mogam worked for 28% of patients. And the patients who were on mogamulizumab lived longer without having their disease come back as well. And that led to FDA approval of mogamulizumab. So what did that take? That took 372 patients across 59 centers across 11 countries. And the study went on for over 4 years, and then leading to its approval. And so it costs a lot of people and a lot of personnel and a lot of time. On top of that, it costs a lot of money. So one of the business magazines had highlighted recently that to get an orphan drug approved, it costs about $166 million, and it takes about 11 years to develop an orphan drug. And so there's a lot of time and resources that are pulled into this. I mentioned the dilemma of these being heterogeneous or like more than one disease and making subclassifications, making it a little bit harder. So again, let me give you another example. So romidepsin is a drug that was approved in 2011 for T-cell lymphoma. The initial studies of romidepsin was in 38 patients that was done at the National Cancer Institute, and then subsequently a 47 patient study in 2002. This led to a international study where 131 patients got romidepsin. There was no control or standard of care arm. Everybody got the drug. And that led to approval of the drug. It required that there be like a follow-on randomized study where half the patients got the drug and half the patients didn't. And for their confirmatory study, they decided to study this medicine as people's first treatment instead of as people's second, third, fourth treatment. And when they did that, the addition of romidepsin did not improve the care to chemotherapy, did not improve outcomes compared to just chemotherapy alone. So if you got chemo with romidepsin or chemotherapy alone, it didn't really make a difference. And there were a lot of reasons for that we can go into why we think the study ended this way. But this is what happened. But that was not the original place where romidepsin was approved. Nevertheless, because it did not meet what we call its primary endpoint, the drug romidepsin was withdrawn from the FDA, so it was no longer deemed to be FDA approved. And when we look at the sub-analysis, half the patients had a subtype of T-cell lymphoma that we think romidepsin works better for. And sure enough, in the study, in the patients who had that subtype, the patients who got romidepsin actually did a little bit better than the patients who got chemotherapy alone. So had the study been done differently from the beginning, maybe the approval would have been different. But we know that hindsight is 2020. When they designed this study, we didn't really understand that about how romidepsin was better for the subtype. We also didn't understand that that was a new subtype at all. There was increasing knowledge about what that subtype was, which is called the TFH phenotype. And had we done this study today, we probably would have designed it completely different. But when we started that, when this process started back in 2012, 2015, all of this was not yet known information. So as I mentioned, the drug approval process can be complicated. So just taking back the example of romidepsin, romidepsin was voluntarily withdrawn from approval in peripheral T-cell lymphoma. There are only 3 other drugs now approved in peripheral T-cell lymphoma, and 2 of those are in the same limbo about confirmatory studies. So now we're left in this world of T-cell lymphoma research asking, well, if you have to do a randomized study, what even is the standard option that you should use, and is there one? And this is, I would just highlighted 2 examples in T-cell lymphoma, but in each different rare lymphoma, they have different problems with regards to this. Some of these diseases are pretty indolent or slow growing, and so it can take a very long time before you kind of figure out treatment X is better than treatment Y. And there can be use of what we call surrogate endpoints or different markers of success being used, but those are sometimes scrutinized by regulatory agencies. And internationally, the same markers of success or the same endpoints are not always the same in different countries. And what drugs are available for patients in one country can differ from another, also further complicating the study designs. But when we win, I would say it's especially sweet for those of us who do rare disease research. So there's been a number of studies in rare diseases that have been very successful and really changed the way we treat patients and improved either survival or develop less toxic treatments for people. And that really required a team approach. This is like a picture from the Mighty Ducks, showing a picture of underdogs really coming in for the win. And to show that when we all come together for a common goal, that we can achieve this. And there's another graphic from Ted Lasso, which is one of my favorite shows, showing that if you really believe in the mission and the rest of your team believes with you, similarly, you can come together to answer a relatively simple question and improve the care for patients. So there's definitely a route forward. And I think in the research community, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this with my colleagues about ways to make clinical research more efficient, that could use what we call real world data sets and not requiring everybody to be split between standard treatment and the new treatment, but using existing registry data to serve as a benchmark of how patients do. Make it easier for patients to go on studies, minimize the requirements and unnecessary testing for patients, do studies where they are not focused in one center, but the hub of the study is a national hub or a decentralized hub, that then it makes it easier for many, many sites to open studies, including community hospital sites. As well. And then for certain studies, there are elements of what we call crossover, where if you get the standard treatment arm and it's not working for you, that you can move on to the experimental treatment arm. And that makes it a lot easier for patients as well. And so Vivek Subbiah, who used to be at MD Anderson, had written this in an editorial a couple of years ago, showing that as the technology rapidly evolves, we have the potential to transform and design the outcomes of clinical research. And this will minimize the gap between when we find a drug that we think is effective, and then putting it into a randomized study, and then developing a better understanding of that when we then employ that drug into the real world. So I tell my mentees to be a persister, to be persistent in your goals, understand why you're trying to do what you want to do, and ultimately it all comes down to the patients. Develop studies smartly, carefully consider all the details, and to be careful of over-optimistic estimations that usually bite you later on. Create the study that's big enough to look for what you're looking for, but not so big that it's unachievable. Develop consensus amongst patients, your academic colleagues, industry, other funding sources, to try to answer a question that's important to everybody, not just to you, and try to learn from your mistakes. And some of that we do through the blood sampling or analyzing people's tissue later to figure out why one treatment works for one group and not the other. And it can't say enough the importance of collaboration. Doing rare disease research requires a lot of collaboration because no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. That's from one of my kids' favorite children's books. And there are national organizations, including the NCCN, the U.S. cooperative groups, the Experimental Clinical Trials Network. Those are all funded, many of which are funded through the National Cancer Institute, to help facilitate and be a place where rare disease researchers can come together to answer a question. So supporting rare disease research is really important. That includes places that do an excellent job of this, like the Lymphoma Research Foundation. Supporting institutions that help support rare disease research is also important. And supporting policies that help provide funding for cancer research overall is also incredibly important. And with that, I think we have plenty of time for questions, and I thank you for your support. And then, Victor, should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure, yeah, if that
Yeah.
works for you. And
Okay.
thank you so much, Dr. Mehta Shah, for that wonderful and insightful presentation. So we will now begin our Q&A portion of the program. And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box that you see below. And we will go ahead and read them off as much as we can so we get up to the 3 o'clock hour here on the East Coast. And we do have some questions here already. And the first one is, has there been any progress on cures for extramarginal zone lymphoma, especially those that are not the most common variations?
Yeah, so I think in extranodal marginal zone lymphoma, that's one of those indolent B cell or slow growing B cell lymphomas. These are treatable. They're not necessarily thought to be curable, although there's some patients who go 10 or 15 years without ever needing any treatment for these. And so effectively they're living their lives and not being affected by treatment or the disease. Um, and in those, there are studies being developed of using some of these novel immunotherapies. I don't know yet if those are going to result in cures or not. I think it's a little early to say, but some of those are being supported by the U.S. cooperative groups as well. Those cooperative groups I should have mentioned in my talk are organizations like SWOG, the Alliance, and ECOG, which you might have heard of.
Thank you. The next question is, I have WM or Waldenstrom, which needs treatment. Why would it be better for me to go into a clinical trial instead of just starting with a standard treatment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a good question to ask your healthcare provider because the nature of a trial is very different depending on what the question is in the trial and what the benefit may be to you. Certain trials where half the patients get a standard treatment and half the patients get the new treatment are done because we have prior studies showing that the new treatment is likely more effective than the standard treatment. And that's how, like, if it wasn't the case, those studies would not get approved by the institutional review boards and all these places that are in place, all these organizations that are in place to protect patient rights and make sure that healthcare research is safe. But it depends a little bit on what the study is. And I think that's when I discuss clinical trials with my patients, I go through that in a lot of depth about, what the standard treatment is, what the study is, and why the study may or may not be a great option for you as a patient.
Thank you so much. And great question. And if you need assistance looking for information on clinical trials, please feel free to call our helpline. We have staff that can provide you with that specific type of assistance. So the next question is, what are the preferred treatment schemes for relapsed splenic marginal zone lymphoma?
Yeah, so splenic marginal zone lymphoma is also within the schema of marginal zone lymphoma. That's a lymphoma that involves the bone marrow and the spleen usually. Some of these patients, when their disease comes back, it's many, many years later, and they can try the same treatment they tried before. Some of them then go on to chemotherapy in addition to antibody type of therapy like rituximab. And then there's other treatments that are available for marginal zone lymphoma that then are also used in splenic marginal zone lymphoma. Some of those include more targeted treatment options like things in pill form, like drugs like lenalidomide or drugs like Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And again, but a lot of that depends on the decision making is dependent on kind of what the duration of your remission is.
Thank you. Next question is, I have primary central nervous system lymphoma that has relapsed after receiving methotrexate. Are there any targeted therapies or immunotherapies I should look into? I've heard about acalabrutinib or tirabrutinib. Where can I find more information?
Yeah, so I think, for patients who have CNS lymphoma, that's also a rare disease. Here at WashU, we do have a trial of using acalabrutinib with an immunotherapy. There might be other trials available in your area. For patients who do not have access to clinical trials, we do use these drugs like acalabrutinib or zanubrutinib regularly. Tirabrutinib, I don't think is available in the United States, to my knowledge. But the other drugs are, and we're able to ask insurers to see if they would provide that drug for patients who have relapsed CNS lymphoma. Sometimes it requires a little bit of a back and forth between writing letters to the insurance company explaining the need for those treatments as well. And then there are options of drugs like lenalidomide similarly too that are effective in that population, as well as other chemotherapies and radiation options.
Next one's a little bit of a long one. So it says, I've been suffering for 3 years with angioedema due to acquired C1 inhibitor deficiency with abdominal involvement as a complication of my splenic marginal zone lymphoma. Does anyone have any experience with this? Is it something that can be successfully managed?
Yeah, so there are patients who present with angioedema for splenic marginal zone lymphoma often have improvement in their angioedema with treatment of their marginal zone lymphoma. So usually most people fortunately get better with their first treatment. We hope that happens for you.
And following question, are there any blood biomarker tests specific to duodenal type follicular lymphoma to see the level of disease burden?
There are not currently a blood test to assess disease burden in follicular lymphoma at large, including the duodenal subtype. One of my colleagues here at WashU is currently working on such of a blood test, actually, but that is currently in the research phase and not yet mainstream. And so hopefully in the future there will be ones, but not currently. And he's fortunately also an LRF funded investigator. We thank LRF for that too.
Thank you. And the following question is, can you talk about the role of intuition and collaborative decision-making between doctor and patient for those with extremely rare or orphan lymphomas? So when the treatment team is uncertain and making best educated guesses, how might doctors enroll patients in those processes?
I think I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding the question, so I'll try my best, but then feel free to write back if I don't answer the question. I think the collaboration for between your doctors, especially if they're not as familiar with the disease or diseases, is important for that to be an open communication. I think if physicians are saying, I haven't really dealt with this, or I'm not sure what the best next step is, that's sometimes a clue to ask about like a second opinion or a question about, are there other doctors who I should try to go see to help us decide together or are there other doctors you've collaborated with? Some of those doctors will reach out to experts like throughout the country, throughout the world for guidance about like, what would you do in X situation? That sometimes doesn't replace, that's not like really a full consultation because it's impossible to get all the information in an email to understand a patient in entirety. But certainly there are ways that experts throughout the country help guide local doctors all over the country and all over the world in the care for their patients. So I think having that dialogue is honestly just very important. I treat a lot of T-cell lymphomas and skin T-cell lymphomas, and just where we are at WashU, our catchment area is over 9 states, because there's not always other experts in other states in these diseases. And so it's very common for us to communicate with people by email or by the phone with other doctors because it's not feasible for everybody to come see us, and we understand that.
And the following question is there someone at the LRF I can speak with regarding a triple hit large B cell and follicular diagnosis? I have questions offline if possible, please, that I would like to learn more about research studies. I have seen good news and bad news and just want to talk to an expert. I can actually answer this one, and the answer is yes, absolutely. So if you contact our helpline, we have trained staff who can provide you with information about large B-cell lymphoma, follicular diagnosis, any other lymphoma subtype, and can help you navigate what types of things you're hearing from your doctor and provide additional guidance along about research studies and whatever resources you're looking for. So you can call us at 800-500-9976 or email helpline@lymphoma.org. And so the following question is someone who's diagnosed with Waldenstrom, looks like good response to ibrutinib Rituxan, switched to zanubrutinib due to myalgias and fatigue, now gradually increasing IgM. Other than fatigue and myalgias, no symptoms. When should change in treatment be considered?
I think it's sometimes a little bit hard because sometimes the if the lymphoma is if the Waldenstrom's is being kept at bay where it's not getting worse, and nothing is getting worse, then sometimes we just kind of keep the treatment the same because the next option for treatment may work less well than what you're currently on. So it depends a little bit on judgment. The main issue is if we think the Waldenstrom's is causing other symptoms or other issues. And just from what you described, it seems like things are more stable than getting worse. So I would have that conversation with your healthcare provider.
Thank you. The following question is if you wouldn't mind speaking about adenolymphoma.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that entity, so I'm not sure.
I'm not sure myself, but if you call the helpline, we'll try to find and pinpoint the right information for you. And if you could also speak to responses to TPLL.
Yeah. So TPLL is one of those ultra rare leukemia lymphomas. There aren't a lot of standard treatments. There's very few studies. The treatment of TPLL is a little bit dependent on what people's blood counts are and their age. And whether things like stem cell transplants are a reasonable option for the patient. And so I think it depends a bit on that. There are some treatments that are very effective, but are very immunosuppressive, such as Campath, that are used in that disease, as well as some trials do include TPLL that include oral agents as well.
And how rare is leukemic non-Hodgkin mantle cell lymphoma?
Yeah, I mean, mantle cell lymphoma only makes up about 1 to 2% of all lymphomas, and then the leukemic non-nodal mantle cell lymphoma is even like a less common form. But some of those patients actually do really well, based on the genomics that usually underlie that lymphoma, but it is firmly in the rare disease category.
Following question, is romidepsin/Vidaza, I believe, treatment for AITL relapse?
Yeah, there is a publication using that combination in AITL that was published now, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. And so that is on the armamentarium of options. And some people will choose to use either one of those medicines alone instead of together.
And are topical ointments available for treatment of cutaneous lymphoma?
Yeah, cutaneous lymphomas are often started to be treated with things like topical steroids as well as topical retinoids. And there are even topical chemotherapies. And so to talk to your doctor about those.
And how about triple hit DLBCL treatment?
Yeah, so triple hit diffuse large B-cell lymphoma is a subtype of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. The name for that entity has changed multiple times in the last few years as well, making it a little bit hard for patients to follow what is pertinent to them. Those are patients whose lymphomas are really triggered by genetic rearrangements in the cancer cells and certain proteins. Those patients can respond to chemotherapy, and so they're often treated with standard chemotherapy to start. But some of those patients may have their lymphoma come back or not go away after their initial treatment, and then they're considered sometimes for other immunotherapies as well, like CAR T cells.
And how common is it to have non-Hodgkin and Hodgkin lymphoma at the same time?
Yeah, it's pretty uncommon to have both at the same time, but there are some diseases that are rare that look like both, and they actually are just one disease and not two. And so in those cases in particular, I think it's really important to have the pathology reviewed at an expert center. But there's a few entities where it's really a mixture of both, and it's really one lymphoma. And then there are other times where people may be diagnosed with one and diagnosed with the other, but it turned out to be the same lymphoma the whole time. It was just a little bit harder to figure out. So again, the pathology review at an expert center becomes very important there.
And is body pain treatment after chemo available?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people who have used things like acupuncture and massage and those types of things for pain and discomfort. And then there are specific treatments available for neuropathy, which is a common complication of chemotherapy or cancer treatment that can be painful for some. So.
And how concerned are research institutions with the threat of research funding potentially stopping?
I think research institutions are very, 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 very worried about this. I spend some of my time advocating for these things, so I would encourage you, if you feel strongly about it, to also call your legislators to make your opinions known, because we do think that the cuts in NIH funding will result in potentially hiring freezes, potentially layoffs at research institutions, potentially stopping funding programs that already exist, and some of that is already ongoing. So I think it's an issue very dear to me because I have a real passion for cancer treatment and rare diseases, and I certainly think it impacts you and your doctors more than you would imagine in ways that you probably don't even realize. So.
I agree. It's also something that we're very closely watching. Research, it's in our name, and we do provide career grants to researchers. So it's something that we're very mindful of, and certainly welcome, just as Dr. Minisha say, that you reach out to your congressmen and women and engage with us at the foundation as well.
Yeah, and there are national efforts to peacefully make those opinions known. And I think some of those are happening actually later this week. So if you are interested in participating or they're going on in your area, feel free to look that up.
Thank you. And as we have a 6-year-old very healthy female recently diagnosed with high-grade triple hit lymphoma. It appears that the standard of care right now is dose adjusted R-EPOCH followed by CAR T cell and our bispecific T cell engagers. So who exactly at LRF can help us find a clinical study in the New York area that uses CAR T cell and BiTE much sooner? So again, in this situation, I would highly encourage you to call our helpline, who can assist with that type of request. We have a clinical trials information service where we can actually do the search for you and help you locate trials depending where you're looking.
Yeah, and I think some of those trials are available in the New York area. Some of the trials we work on are certainly open there. So.
And follow-up question is, are there any trials ongoing for Waldenstrom? And also, what is the average lifespan for Waldenstrom after diagnosis?
Yeah, most people who have Waldenstrom's don't die of Waldenstrom's. They often are able to live with their diseases. I think the lifespan is a little bit dependent on your response to your first treatment and how long some people with Waldenstrom's are observed initially as well, and how long does it take to get treatment. So I would talk to your healthcare provider about kind of ascertaining your own risk specifically, but most people do okay.
And how often does lymphoma turn into another type of cancer? I have classic follicular lymphoma and responded well to the bendamustine and obinutuzumab. I haven't been able to continue the immunotherapy and just hope it won't turn into another cancer.
Yeah, I mean, follicular lymphoma has a rate of moving from any slow-growing lymphoma can grow into a faster-growing lymphoma. And follicular lymphoma, that happens in about 1% per year. So most people with follicular lymphoma, that doesn't happen for them. So hopefully, again, not for you.
And please comment on CAR T treatment. It was the only one offered to me.
Yeah, so CAR T cells are genetically engineered immune cells. Sometimes, usually the standard ones available are from your own T immune cells that are then engineered in a laboratory to find the cancer and fight the cancer, and then infused back into the patient to help attack the cancer. And those have been approved since 2017 or so. and our standard treatment as patient second treatment for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and then are also standard treatment for other lymphomas. Sometimes it's the only treatment that's offered in the setting where it's been proven that CAR T cells are superior than all the other treatments. But that's also a discussion to have with your healthcare provider.
And is secondary CNS MZL considered a rare disease?
That would be considered a rare disease. I think marginal zone lymphoma is already rare, and then having central nervous system involvement is also quite uncommon, but we do see it.
And are there any clinical trials looking to boost the immune system with nutrition and supplements?
There are studies being developed, and then there's some of those studies are being done through registry programs like the LEO consortium, which is the Lymphoma Epidemiology Outcomes consortium as well. So there are efforts to do that, but those studies tend to take a very long time to follow people and tend to be very large. So they've been a little bit hard to fund.
And has there been any progress on cures or the management of PTCL? FYI, had course of BVCHP, ICE, GDP clinical trial that was unsuccessful after diagnosis. The patient unfortunately lost after 18 months.
Yeah, there has been a number of drugs that have been in development that have shown a lot of promise in what we call phase 2 studies. Some of those drugs are currently in phase 3 studies for peripheral T-cell lymphoma, and some of those we think are going to lead to more people being able to get bone marrow transplants, which is a potential cure. So I think that world has rapidly changed in the last 5 or 6 years with more and more drugs being developed specifically for T-cell lymphoma. So I'm sorry about your family member, but.
And how is progress for mantle cell lymphoma?
There's, I think, tremendous progress for mantle cell lymphoma. So, when I was a fellow, which wasn't that long ago, less than 10 years ago, we used to quote people a fairly worrisome prognosis for mantle cell lymphoma. And we're currently in an era where each year some large practice-changing study happens in mantle cell lymphoma, improving the outcomes for patients, either leading to more people being able to be off of treatment for longer, or developing less toxic treatments for mantle cell lymphoma, and there's people's first treatment. And so I think that world is going to continue to change, but there's been a lot of progress in trying to figure out ways to add oral medicines, replace stem cell transplants in mantle cell lymphoma, develop immunotherapies in mantle cell lymphoma, develop novel combinations of targeted medicines in mantle cell lymphoma. Not to keep harping on the U.S. cooperative groups, but there were 2 U.S. cooperative group studies presented within this last year in mantle cell lymphoma that are also practice changing. And so I think that's an excellent example of how rare disease research and collaboration can occur successfully.
And my son was diagnosed with NLPHL stage 2 in 2019. He received proton radiation and was cancer-free until a recent CT scan showed 3 suspicious lymph nodes. During your presentation, you advised that certain disease is treatable and some are curable. Which category would NLPHL fall? He's considering another round of radiation therapy, but is concerned that an aggressive approach could transform the disease.
Yeah, again, I think there's some difficulty in confirmation of whether someone with nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma has transformed into a more aggressive lymphoma. Sometimes that pathology can be quite confusing on the part of clinicians and pathologists, and probably review at an academic medical center is probably important in that situation, because there are times where we move to chemotherapy, and there are times where we just consider radiation again, or less intensive therapy.
And how important is bone marrow infiltration percentage? How homogeneous is the bone marrow infiltration? Seems like the sample size and evaluated cells are pretty small.
Yeah, so I think bone marrow biopsies percentage of involvement may not be super critical in most of the diseases. There was an era where we relied on that a little bit more, but in the current era with the ability to assess disease by PET scans and things like that, we rely on that information a little bit less. But it does help the doctor figure out how much treatment your bone marrow can tolerate.
And we do have time for one more question. So that question is, I have AITL in remission now for 2 years. My question is about CD30. CD30 was low. If I had a relapse, should I ask for another look at the CD30 expression? So far, that is the only new development so far.
Yeah, so I think in AITL, there's another question about AITL that's relapsed as well. That's a form of T-cell lymphoma for which there's been a lot of improvement. Some of the drugs that I mentioned that have been studied look like they're particularly good for AITL. Some of those have led to continued national and international studies, like in the family of EZH2 inhibitors, PI3 kinase inhibitors, as well as ITK inhibitors, and some of those studies are available in the United States. I think rechecking the CD30 status is helpful, although once you're CD30 positive, we do consider CD30 targeting therapy like brentuximab amongst the options for treatment regardless.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mehta Shah, for being here today, and also to our audience for their great questions. If you did not get your question answered, we please encourage you to attend any of our other programs that offer more disease-specific sessions, or of course, calling our helpline at 1-800-500-9976 or emailing us at helpline@lymphoma.org. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Of course, thank you for listening. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.